Chapter 12, Reflections. In over 40 years of working with the visually handicapped, my theme has always been that blindness is no respecter of persons. Loss of sight affects wealthy people as well as the poor, youngsters as well as the aged, the highly educated as well as the illiterate. Blindness strikes individuals regardless of nationality, religion, or race. When we founded the Rehabilitation Center in Arkansas, I knew we would have to serve clients on a regional basis, and I suspected that someday we would offer our services to trainees on a nationwide scale. But in the beginning, I never dreamed that eventually our program would become international in scope. As various individuals visited the AEB under the sponsorship of the United Nations or the U.S. State Department, I became interested in their respective countries and how each of these nations dealt with the problems of blindness. Since the Lions are an international organization, I not only wanted to expand our services to meet the needs of blind people from foreign countries, but I also wanted to journey to those nations and observe the kinds of assistance being offered citizens with visual handicaps. As a result, over the last 2 decades, many of my fondest memories center around our foreign trainees and the many places all over the world in which I have had the opportunity to travel. Our first international trainee, Young Bong Park of Seoul, South Korea, came to the center following the Korean War. Although awarded a scholarship to Perkins School for the Blind in Watertown, Massachusetts, Mr. Park decided to follow the recommendation of Tuk Hyung Lee, the superintendent of Korea's National School for the Blind, and participate in our adjustment program before proceeding to Massachusetts. Since the AEB was being asked to provide free training, I had to propose the idea to our board. At first, some board members hesitated because we were operating on a limited budget, but I convinced them the training of a foreign national would be both a challenge and an opportunity. Even though Mr. Park had a college degree in English literature when he arrived at the center, language proved to be a formidable obstacle since English with a Korean accent widely differs from English with an Arkansas accent. Once we overcame this initial barrier, Mr. Park learned mobility and the other basic skills we taught and became one of our most beloved trainees. After 3 months at the AEB, he proceeded to Boston to accept his scholarship at Perkins. Before completing his 9-month tenure in the East, Mr. Park wrote me and asked if he could spend another summer at the AEB before returning to Korea. Because his first visit with us had been so successful, our board agreed to this extension, and Mr. Park spent an additional 3 months in Little Rock. Upon returning to Seoul, Mr. Park worked as an instructor at the local school for the blind before founding the first rehabilitation center for the adult blind in the history of Korea. With the aid of an ophthalmologist, he established a training program that included orientation and mobility, instruction, Braille, and personal adjustment training. Mr. Park and his wife founded a Braille publication in an effort to create a sense of community among the blind of Korea. In the early 1960s, he wrote me that he had been named the executive director of the Korean National Council for the Blind, which coordinated all of the work for the visually handicapped throughout the nation. In 1979, Bernice and I had the opportunity to tour East Asia, and our trip included a lengthy visit with Mr. Park and his wife in Seoul. I was amazed at what this man had accomplished with the minimal instruction he had received in the United States. Because of financial pressures, Mr. Park had been unable to earn a living for his family from the Rehabilitation Center, so he had worked as a masseur at night. In Korea, only blind persons are trained and licensed in this area, and even though his wife objected to his being a masseur because of his high level of education, Mr. Park found that this was the only way he could earn enough money to support himself while he kept the center open. Blessed with a great deal of imagination and energy, eventually Mr. Park opened his own massage clinic and hired other blind individuals to work for him. In Korea, hotels often massage as a basic service, like a barber shop or beauty shop, and the blind of Korea regarded our host as a successful and wealthy person. During our stay in Seoul, Mr. Park arranged for us to use a car with a driver to explore the city and held a banquet dinner in our honor. We thoroughly enjoyed the reunion and greatly admired Mr. Park's fine work for the blind in Korea. Although we have trained numerous individuals from East Asia, along with Yongbong Park, a young Korean girl named Kim Wicks made a special impression on me. During the North Korean invasion of the South in 1950, Kim and her family lost their home and became refugees, fleeing before the invading army. At one point, despite warnings not to look, 3-year-old Kim watched the explosion of a bomb that detonated near the family. The flash scarred the corneas of her eyes and left the little girl totally blind. A few days later, Kim's father became so despondent over the hopeless situation, he threw Kim and her 2-year-old sister into a nearby river in a misguided effort to save his children from more misery. His wife's pleas caused him to reverse his irrational decision, and although he rescued Kim, the other child drowned. The family rejoined the other refugees and walked over 200 miles to the southern tip of South Korea. During the arduous journey, the mother became separated from the rest of the family, and again, in desperation, Kim's father placed his remaining daughter in an orphanage and then disappeared. Kim spent 7 years as the only blind child in the Christian missionary orphanage, until a family named Wicks from Indianapolis, Indiana, heard about her through an international relief agency and adopted her. The Wicks put their new daughter through the Indiana School for the Blind and then through the Wheaton Academy and the University of Indiana, where she majored in music. Because of her musical talent and academic ability, Kim received a Fulbright scholarship to study music in Vienna. During her residence in Austria, she participated in a series of religious musical festivals in Switzerland. While performing at one of these events, Kim met the American evangelist Billy Graham, who invited her to sing with his religious crusade. After working with Graham for a while, Kim moved to West Memphis, Arkansas, where she started her own ministry under the sponsorship of some local businessmen. Soon afterwards, I invited her to come to Little Rock to address one of our monthly luncheons because I knew what a tremendous inspiration she would be to our trainees. Her performance more than exceeded my expectations. Accompanied by recorded music, she illustrated her talk with several beautiful songs and left everyone at the AEB talking about her visit for weeks. After the luncheon, I escorted Kim on a tour of the center. During our conversation, she said, "Oh my, I wish I had known about a rehabilitation program like this. I never had the opportunity to learn some of these things." Kim impressed me so much that I invited her to sing for our upcoming visiting district governor's day, and in exchange offered her the chance to train at the center for a while. She accepted my proposal and spent a few weeks with us, allowing the AEB to claim her as a former trainee. Over the last few years, I have tried to help her ministry by recommending her to various religious and civic groups, I think she has a wonderful and inspirational message, and I also believe she represents what a talented and determined blind person can accomplish. As I became more enthusiastic about training people from other countries at the center, I began to realize there were many inherent difficulties in this type of expansion. With an increasing number of foreign applications, we needed additional funds, since the tuition and training fees for these people could not be paid by a state vocational rehabilitation agency. I also perceived a reluctance on the part of some of the local Lion Club members to share our limited funds with people from other countries. To overcome these obstacles, I approached several internationally oriented foundations about possible grants to help offset the cost of training foreign nationals. I soon discovered that when I mentioned the Arkansas Enterprises for the Blind, foundation directors, especially those in the East, immediately lost interest in my proposal. They assumed any institution in Arkansas would be limited in scope, and thought the word enterprises connoted a workshop. In their minds, a struggling workshop in the backwoods of Arkansas deserved little, if any, consideration for a grant to train blind people from all over the world. Out of frustration, we considered changing the name of the center, but because of state pride, most of our board members resisted this move. To solve the dilemma, I suggested the AEB incorporate another organization with a separate and more international name that would act as an affiliate service. As a result, in 1971 we incorporated the International Services for the Blind. The ISB functioned as both a fundraising organization and one that sponsored research and the training of professional men and women from various nations in response to a worldwide demand for increased rehabilitation services for the blind. Soon after its inauguration, our new organization received recognition and assistance from a variety of groups, including the Partners of the Americas, Lions International Foundation, Rotary International, and the Pan American Health Organization. The first line of support for the ISB, however, soon became our own annual light bulb sale. Through an agreement with Westinghouse, we acted as a broker for selling light bulbs to Lions clubs and other civic groups for their individual fundraising efforts. This undertaking gave us a regular source of funds for the international program. The ISB proved to be a successful venture from the beginning, and in 1974, the World Council for the Welfare of the Blind accepted our organization as a voting member. Over the years, we have maintained the ISB as a separate nonprofit group that contracts for management and other services with the Arkansas Enterprises for the Blind. As the executive director of AEB, I coordinated the work of the International Services for the Blind, and upon my retirement, the board elected me to serve as the president of the ISB on a volunteer basis. The ISB board meets annually and reflects a global character with members from Mexico City, Colombia, and Saudi Arabia, as well as the United States. Over the last few years, my work with the ISB has broadened my awareness of the discrepancies that exist from nation to nation in regard to the work for the blind. While some countries offer advanced and sophisticated new systems to aid their blind citizens, other nations lag decades behind in providing any kind of assistance for visually handicapped adults. While my duties with the ISB have increased my understanding of these differences, my own personal travels have provided me with first-hand knowledge of exactly how the movement for the blind is progressing throughout the world. My first foreign venture took place under the auspices of the American Foundation for the Overseas Blind, when a representative of that organization asked me to take a short-term assignment as a consultant in El Salvador in 1963. Since I had always been interested in travel as well as the international character of the work for the blind, I eagerly accepted the invitation. Accompanied by Bernice and our younger son Peter, I spent 6 weeks in El Salvador, helping to expand a school for the blind children to include a rehabilitation program for blind adults. During our stay, we lived on a campus and made a host of friends among the students and staff. The school's physical plant consisted of $1 million facility donated by one of the country's wealthiest families. In fact, several wealthy individuals enhanced the institution's program by volunteering on a regular basis. An American-educated ophthalmologist served as the official director of the program, although a young lady named Irma Gomez ran the day-to-day operation of the school. The stated earlier organized a commission for the handicapped, which aided the volunteer group with the funding of their program, and I felt that, at the time, the officials of El Salvador had made a fine start in their overall program to aid the blind and other handicapped persons. In my final report, I recommended the agency maintain the Rehabilitation Center for the Adult Blind and consider placing some of their graduates in assembly line jobs. I toured a local cigarette factory and identified some positions that could easily be filled by blind workers. Before we left El Salvador, I invited Irma Gomez to come to the United States and visit our center in Little Rock, and a few years later she accepted my offer. Irma studied Arkansas's vending stand program closely, and when she returned to El Salvador, she initiated a project to establish stand locations for blind persons in her own country. She did a remarkable job of following through on our recommendations and had a real impact on improving the services for the blind in El Salvador. From time to time, under the auspices of the ISB, she sent a few of her staff members to Little Rock for further training at our center. I have never met anyone more dedicated to serving the blind than Irma Gomez. For 20 years she lived at the school, devoting her life to aiding the blind individuals who came to the facility for aid. The last time I saw Irma, at a conference in 1979, she seemed under tremendous stress. The Marxist terrorists of El Salvador had launched a pre-revolutionary campaign of assassination and intimidation, and she told us that she often found hastily scrawled bomb threats lying on her desk or tacked to the door of her office. She had adopted a little girl, and just before Christmas in 1980, we received a letter from Irma saying that conditions had degenerated to the point that she had resigned her position at the school to go into hiding because of personal threats to herself and her child. That message was the last communication I received from Irma, and every time I remember her, I am reminded of the tragedy of this dedicated woman whose dreams of a lifetime were destroyed by political fanaticism. Long before my trip to El Salvador and my friendship with Irma, I met a fascinating visually handicapped young man from Bogota, Colombia. A graduate student at George Peabody College for Teachers in Nashville, Tennessee, Hernando Padilla visited our rehabilitation center in Little Rock during his Thanksgiving vacation in 1953. Because he admired our program, I invited him to return and be our guest for a month after his graduation. He accepted my offer and became so inspired by our work at the AEB that when he returned to Bogota, he secured the cooperation of the Lions and other groups to establish his own rehabilitation center based on the model of the Arkansas Enterprises for the Blind. Along the way, as we instructed several additional foreign trainees, the American Foundation for Overseas Blind, now Helen Keller International, recognized our work and began to refer other individuals from abroad to the AEB for training. For example, they sent Romero de Gregorio to Little Rock for his initial adjustment training. A middle-aged man from Montevideo, Uruguay. Romero had been a businessman and a member of the Lions Club before losing his sight. Like Hernando Padilla, Romero completed our course, returned to his native land, and started a rehabilitation center for blind adults. We had similar experience with Matthew Musa, a young man who trained at the AEB and then went home to Panama City, Panama, to develop a rehabilitation facility in cooperation with the Salvation Army. Some of my proudest moments in my career came in 1971 when I toured the rehabilitation centers of Hernando Padilla, Romero de Gregorio, Irma Gomez, and Matthew Musa in Latin America. To find each one of these former AEB trainees at the forefront of his respective nation's attempts to aid the blind gave me the gratifying sensation that my own life's work had made an impact on the international movement to help the visually handicapped. Despite the fine efforts of these AEB alumni, the attitudes toward blindness in most Latin America nations continued to lag behind the United States by as much as 50 years. On our tour in 1971, we talked to many people who still believed that if a person went blind, they were automatically condemned to a life of idleness. If that sightless individual came from an affluent family, he or she would be cared for, but if they lived in poverty, they would be forced to beg on the streets for the remainder of their lives. I remember the many people in Arkansas who held similar beliefs a half-century earlier, and I recall the struggles we went through to change those attitudes. I can only hope that my friends helping the blind in Latin America will be able to destroy those misconceptions faster than we did in some parts of the United States. The year after my Latin American journey, I attended the International Rehabilitation Congress in Sydney, Australia. While I enjoyed the Congress itself as an informative international exchange of ideas and an opportunity to renew old friendships, on a side trip to New Zealand, I discovered the most comprehensive program for the blind I have observed anywhere in the world. If the attitudes toward the blind in Latin America reflected the past, the programs in New Zealand provided a vision of the future. The New Zealand Foundation for the Blind started as a volunteer organization in the 1980s. Later, when the government became involved in various social welfare programs, officials continued to operate in the area of aid for the blind under a contractual agreement with the private organization rather than establish a purely state-operated system. As one counselor told me, New Zealand's goal is to serve the blind from womb to tomb. This comprehensive program includes an ultra-modern school for the blind, an eye care and blindness prevention program subsidized by the state, and a system of hostelries or homes for the elderly blind, which are pleasant places operated in a manner designed to maintain the dignity of the individual. The New Zealanders also finance the college educations of qualified blind persons, and even have a governmental system to pay for special teachers for blind youngsters who choose to remain in public school rather than the National Residential School for the Blind. Perhaps the most amazing facet of the plan involves placing every blind person in New Zealand on a computer register. Each individual on that list receives a visit once a year by a field staff member of the agency or a social worker, and in addition receives a monthly pension regardless of their economic status. While the population of New Zealand is relatively small, with a limited number of blind people, Nevertheless, no other country offers such a comprehensive program to help their visually handicapped citizens. The New Zealand system offers the rest of the world a magnificent model of progressive attitudes toward aiding the blind. If compassion is the hallmark of the New Zealand system, efficiency is the chief characteristic of the state-operated program for the blind in the Soviet Union. Anxious to learn more about the Soviet method of aiding the blind, I had written to officials in the field prior to my visit to Leningrad and Moscow in 1973. I never received a response from those rehabilitation officers, and I found making an appointment after my arrival in Moscow to be impossible. I did learn that the Soviets follow a similar system employed in some of the Eastern European nations. The government designates one factory to employ blind people and constructs apartment houses nearby to provide a village for all the visually handicapped. The system is one of almost total segregation, and while the Soviets regard the concept as efficient and humane, Westerners tend to dislike the program because of the lack of individual choice. Throughout my travels, I have generally found that the places that utilize the most modern concepts of education and rehabilitating the blind tend to be areas that once had a strong British influence. For example, the Hong Kong Society for the Blind operates a rehabilitation center and a factory primarily with blind employees that stresses giving the visually handicapped dignity through independence. I discovered a similar situation in India, where despite the overwhelming poverty of the nation as a whole, the programs for the blind in the urban areas seem relatively enlightened. Over the past 2 decades, by attending International Lions conventions and meeting of global organizations for the blind, I have had the privilege of visiting many nations ranging from Israel, Egypt, and Jordan to Japan, Taiwan, and the People's Republic of China. In Wiesbaden, Germany, I had a wonderful personal experience when I discovered the jewelry shop of my ancestor named Christoph Kumpe, which dated back to 1810. As a part of that same trip, we explored the old Hesse area, including the lovely gardens that surround some of the local castles. On that particular occasion, I felt a great sense of generational unity with my great-grandfather, who, before journeying to America, began life as a gardener at one of those same castles. No matter where we've traveled, I've observed that any place with a core of dedicated people who honestly believe in the ability and potential of the blind is making progress toward creating a new life for the visually handicapped. While the world capitals I have been fortunate to visit are geographically a long way from Little Rock, I've always felt at home each time I've encountered those individuals, no matter what their nationality, who share my interest in the international rehabilitation movement. Every career offers certain remunerations, and I regard the friends I have made both here and abroad who have shared my zeal for our cause to be among the most rewarding aspects of my 40 years in the work for the blind. A great sense of mission permeates our professional conferences and conventions, which almost always seem like a reunion of old friends. Through the years, I have attended hundreds of these meetings, and each time I have found inspiration from the exchanges of ideas that mark the conferences, from the renewed sense of community that binds all of us together. For many years, I especially looked forward to certain national meetings because I knew I would have an opportunity to visit with Father Tom Carroll. Although Father Carroll was sighted, many people referred to him as the blind priest because of his dedication to helping the visually handicapped. I first encountered Father Carroll and his dynamic personality at a 1954 AAWB conference in Houston, Texas. That same year, he founded the St. Paul's Rehabilitation Center in Newton, Massachusetts, and from that time on, because of our mutual concerns and paralleled careers, we became close friends. Our relationship was often marked by friendly disagreements over how rehabilitation centers should be operated. Well into the 1960s, Father Carroll and I continued to argue over his concept of rehabilitation as a group undertaking. He contended that the most efficient way of aiding the adult blind was to start a group of 12 or 14 blind persons as a class and have them move through the various training disciplines together, participate in group therapy sessions, and thereby eliminate the tremendous sense of loneliness that characterizes many recently blinded individuals. I countered that no two people were alike, and that, from my own experience, no pair of trainees progressed through their training at the same rate. Therefore, I argued a rehabilitation center should be based on a system of individualized instruction that recognized that all blind people are not the same. Although Father Carroll and I differed on other matters, such as his proposal for separate training programs for the partially sighted, in spite of our friendly disagreements, we developed a bond of respect and admiration based on our shared goal of helping the blind. Father Carroll served as the chaplain for the blinded veterans at the Old Farms Convalescent Hospital at Avon, and also wrote a wonderful book entitled Blindness, What Is It, What It Does, and How to Live With It, which remains one of the best introductory works on the subject. I always had the greatest regard for Father Carroll, and after the completion of the AEB's new buildings, I invited him to participate in one of our training seminars in Little Rock. During a tour of the facility, Father Carroll paused in front of the door to our Techniques of Daily Living room. For some reason, we had changed the terminology to Daily Demands of Living, and the sign on the door had been abbreviated to Daily Demands. Father Carroll pointed at the sign and said, "Roy, is that the toilet?" I always learned a lot from Father Carroll, even regarding small matters. Soon after his departure, we returned to the term Techniques of Daily Living, and I quietly had the sign on the door changed. Father Carroll's death in 1971 marked the passing of one of the dominant figures in the rehabilitation movement for an entire generation. A year later, the directors of his center in Massachusetts appropriately renamed the facility the Carroll Rehabilitation Center for the Visually Impaired. Despite our philosophical differences, I regarded Father Carroll as one of the brightest and most dedicated members of our profession, and I believe his numerous achievements are best measured by the thousands of blind people whose lives were enriched by the work of the blind priest. A second inspiring individual I met through my career in working with the visually handicapped was Dr. Richard Kinney, blinded as a child during his freshman year in college. Dick also lost his hearing. In spite of his double handicap, he graduated summa cum laude from Mount Union College in Ohio. He also took some correspondence courses from the Hadley School for the Blind in Winnetka, Illinois, and so impressed the faculty there that they offered him a position at the institution. Dick had a little more modulation in his voice than many deaf-blind individuals because he had once been able to hear, and he became involved in the public relations activities of the school. He also married a blind girl, but she died suddenly, leaving Dick to raise their 6-year-old son alone. With the assistance of his family, Dick reared the child himself while advancing over the years to the position of president of the Hadley School. Even though arthritis restricted him to a wheelchair later in his life, Dick traveled all over the world to promote the interests of the Hadley School and the education of the blind. He visited Little Rock on several occasions, and in the mid-1970s I invited him to speak to one of our International Services for the Blind board meetings. During the course of Dick's stay in the city, Governor David Pryor commissioned him as an Arkansas traveler, a state distinction presented to visiting dignitaries. Before his death a couple of years ago, Dick wrote several moving poems about the nature of human existence for publication. In my estimation, Richard Kinney was a great man whose dedication to life and service, despite his many handicaps, personified the concept of human courage. A bold spirit also marked the career of Louis Rives, who one of my closest friends in the rehabilitation movement. Blinded as an infant, Louis attended public school in Virginia and later received both a bachelor's and a law degree from William and Mary College in Williamsburg. He began a distinguished career as a federal employee in 1943 when he joined the staff of the General Counsel of the Federal Services Administration. I first met Lou while attending a training seminar in Washington, D.C., where he delivered an outstanding address explaining the implications of the new Barton-Lafayette legislation. We became close friends after Lou became an assistant to the regional representatives of the Vocational Rehabilitation Office in Dallas. He visited our center in Little Rock on several occasions, and he and I spent many hours discussing the future of the rehabilitation program. Eventually, Lou became the chief of the Office of the Blind in Washington. In that capacity, he supported the efforts of the AEB to acquire available grants, including the Hill-Burton funds for our first expansion program. Lou later headed the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Social Rehabilitation Services, but at the age of 55, after 30 years as a federal employee, he decided to retire. I happened to be in Washington when he announced his retirement, so I asked him if he planned to leave Washington. He told me he had considered several different places, but had not made a final decision. By coincidence, I needed someone to direct our research grant program, and so I suggested Lou consider retiring to Arkansas. A few weeks later, Lou and his wife, Marcy, came to Little Rock as our house guests to see what they thought of Arkansas, and before they left, they made a down payment on a home in the city. Following his retirement, Lou joined the AEB as the Director of Research and Staff Development. During his tenure with us, Lou also served as the President of the National Accreditation Council, and with his knowledge of federal programs and his many friends in Washington, he secured several important grants for the center, including the initial funds that established the master's program at UALR. In 1975, after a year and a half with the AEB, Lou received an appointment as the administrator of the State Office for the Blind and Visually Impaired. Although I hated to lose such a valuable staff member, I felt the move would be to advantage of all the blind people of Arkansas, and I especially wanted Lou to take the position since he would be the first blind person to head the agency. Louis Rives did an excellent job in his new position as administrator. After 5 years, however, he retired again, this time to the sunshine of Arizona. Like the telephone company television commercials, he and I still talk to each other over the phone about every 2 weeks. Lou's career had a great influence on the work for the blind throughout the nation, and especially in Arkansas, and I feel fortunate to have been a close friend of such a major figure in the rehabilitation movement. Over the years, I worked closely with many individuals who had a tremendous impact on the work for the blind. People like Robert Barnett, a bright young man from Florida who became the executive director of the American Foundation for the Blind at the age of 31. Mary Switzer, a pioneer in the field who served as the head of the rehabilitation program in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And William Gallagher, the protege of Father Carroll, who rose through the ranks to become the present executive director of AFB. I feel privileged to have had opportunity to experience a close relationship with dedicated individuals like these and many others. To have shared a sense of purpose with such outstanding people has been a never-ending source of inspiration for my own career. In 1978, my commitment to aiding the visually handicapped entered a new phase with my retirement as the executive director of the AEB Rehabilitation Center in Little Rock. For a brief period, my friend Howard H. Hansen, a former head of the state agency for the blind in South Dakota, directed the activities of the center until poor health forced him to relinquish the position. He was succeeded by Jim Cordell, a former teacher and basketball coach who joined our staff as a mobility instructor in 1961 and later served as my assistant executive director. Jim received a master's degree in orientation and mobility from Western Michigan University and married a charming former trainee named Elizabeth Young in the years before he assumed the directorship. Despite our policy against instructors dating students, I'll have to confess, in the case of Jim and Beth, I tended to look the other way. Over the past few years, I have tried to maintain an active retirement by delivering numerous speeches and doing whatever I could to promote the cause of the rehabilitation of the blind. The AEB board designated me founder chairman emeritus, and combined with being president of the International Services for the Blind, I have retained a busy involvement in the field. One activity I have particularly enjoyed since I retired involved planning the Helen Keller Centennial Congress. Under the leadership of William Gallagher, the American Foundation for the Blind sponsored the event on June 27, 1980, in honor of the 100th anniversary of Miss Keller's birth. Since Miss Keller attended both the Perkins School and Radcliffe College, we decided to hold the Congress in Boston. In planning the meeting, we hope to unite all the agencies and organizations of and for the blind to meet together for the first time and honor the remarkable Helen Keller. Our committee started 18 months in advance, and we invited a galaxy of national and international figures to participate in the program. Kim Wicks, my friend from West Memphis, sang both the invocation and the benediction at the Congress, and in between we held a series of seminars centering on the various phases of Helen Keller's career: early years, working years, later years. Arkansas was well represented, since 3 of the 4 main seminars were chaired by people with ties to the state. I presided over the session covering Miss Keller's later years. Max Woolley, the superintendent of the Arkansas School for the Blind, conducted the meeting on early years, and Lou Rives led the session entitled The Rights and Responsibilities of the Blind. During the seminars, we used Helen Keller's life as a vehicle to review the entire history of the work for the blind, assess our efforts at the present time, and speculate on the future direction of the movement. Along with the main seminars, each organization held individual meetings, and various groups sponsored exhibits throughout the course of the Congress. By the time the meetings ended, we all felt the event had succeeded in every way. The various gatherings were attended by over 2,700 people, and the whole affair represented one of the rare high points of cooperation among the many groups involved in the education and rehabilitation of the blind. All organizations of and for the blind were represented, including the NFB, who picketed the National Accreditation Council's board meeting. Along with professional commitments like the Helen Keller Congress, my retirement has been filled with activities that have been of lifelong interest. For example, since the days when I received my baptism in a creek and taught a Sunday school class at the age of 16, I have been interested in comparative religions. During my retirement, I have found the time to study the great faiths of the world: Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christianity. This inquiry has been more than just an intellectual amusement. One of the most disturbing characteristics of newly blinded adults is a tendency to suffer severe religious crisis. Often our trainees questioned their own faith, and many blamed God for their plight. Several even raised provocative questions regarding the nature of a kind and merciful God who had suddenly made them blind. Others became despondent, waiting for a religious miracle to restore their lost sight. Having experienced a close relationship with so many individuals who felt victimized by their own God, I have found the study of religions to be of more value than a simple academic exercise. On the other hand, my personal religious activities have been an endless source of strength and inspiration over the years. After marrying Bernice, I joined the Christian church, and as I often tell my friends, I was reared a Baptist, married a Campbellite, and she made a Christian out of me. Following the Second World War, Bernice and I helped found the Friendly Class, a Sunday school class for young couples. Our group has stayed together, and the Friendly Class still plays an active role in our church and in our lives. I have always believed in serving God through serving mankind, and have tried to structure my life on that premise, not only in my professional life, but also in serving as a Sunday school teacher for a term and as an elder and chairman of our church board. Another area of service that has highlighted my retirement involves the realization of a 52-year-old dream. During my senior year at the Arkansas School for the Blind, a good friend and fellow student approached me one day and said, "Roy, if you graduate from here and then go to college and study law, someday you could come back and be superintendent of the School for the Blind." I laughed and said, "Heck, I don't want to be the superintendent. I want to be on the board and hire the superintendent." In January 1981, Governor Frank White appointed me to the Board of Trustees of the Arkansas School for the Blind, fulfilling my dream of over half a century. After 43 years as principal and superintendent, Dr. J. Max Woolley retired, and I realized my ambition by participating in the selection of Dr. Hugh Pace as superintendent, thus enabling me to make a contribution to the institution where I began my career. Of course, another part of my community service has centered on my work with Lions Clubs. Entering my 42nd year as a Lions Club member, I have attended 40 state conventions and 17 international conventions. In 1958, I helped organize the Park Plaza Lions Club in suburban Little Rock and served as first president. A few years later, I served a term as the Lions District Governor. One Lions function I have particularly enjoyed over the years is the annual Visiting District Governors Day, under the sponsorship of the Arkansas Lions and the AEB. Back in 1961, with my encouragement, Ed Berry took the initiative of inviting the district governors from Arkansas's 6 adjoining states to come to Little Rock and see our rehabilitation center firsthand. Initially, we hoped this event would publicize the center and provide an understanding of our training of the blind who came to AEB from their states. In the last few years, however, under the leadership of Dr. Fowler, the event has grown to have international significance in the Lions movement. As a member of the board of Lions International, Jim began inviting all the international officers and board members to Little Rock for the District Governor's Day. Eventually, we added an International Family Night, and by the early 1980s, the visiting District Governor's Day had become one of the largest meetings of Lions dignitaries in the United States. Another welcomed result of this meeting is the fact that many other states have adopted AEB as their Lions Club's project and support it financially. The Lions Club has been an integral part of my life for almost half a century. The group has provided me with a vehicle for service and a social outlet, and although I recognize businessmen's luncheon clubs are not without their critics, the Lions Club has been a positive factor in my life for over 4 decades. Participation in the Lions Club and the church, combined with various professional commitments, have made retirement a lively period in my life. I have slowed down to some extent, which has given me the opportunity to reflect upon the events, activities, and rewards of the past half-century. Part of my reflections have quite naturally centered on my visual handicap. While I believe dwelling on what might have been to be a pointless exercise, nevertheless my lack of sight has unquestionably had an impact on the direction of my life. There have been occasions when I believe that other people, upon discovering my handicap, suddenly felt I lacked the competence of a fully sighted person. Many times, whether in politics or business or in my work at the AEB, I experienced this subtle form of discrimination. Consequently, I think one of my underlying goals throughout my career has been to hasten the day when we will all judge people by their abilities and not their disabilities. Adjusting to partial sight has also been characterized by inconvenience and a few embarrassing moments. Probably the most awkward incident in this regard took place at a new eating establishment in North Little Rock some years ago. We were dining with the chairman of the AEB board, and as we left the restaurant, I moved ahead of our party to admire the decorative statues in the foyer of the building. I reached out and touched one of the figures, as I had done with the cathedral sculptures in Europe. When I realized I was touching real flesh, I immediately said, "Excuse me." Just then our board chairman arrived, and I told him I thought the woman was a statue. He quickly turned to the lady and said, "You'll have to excuse him, he's blind, and he thought you were a statue." The woman proceeded to rescue me to some extent by replying, "Oh, well, that's all right. I am stoned." Throughout my childhood in rural Pulaski County, our roads were unpaved, and inevitably, following a heavy rain, at least one automobile would become stuck in the mud somewhere near Ironton. On most of these occasions, my father would hitch his team of mules to the wagon and ride off to offer his assistance to the stranded motorists. I enjoyed riding to the rescue with him, although he always puzzled me by refusing to accept any rewards from the grateful individuals whose cars had been pulled from the muck. My father always politely refused the offers of money, saying, "All you owe me is to help the next guy you find stuck in the mud." From my father's example, I developed a philosophy of service, and as I grew older, the idea of helping others became the cornerstone of my career. Even though I did find a measure of happiness and success in politics and business, my primary concern has always been aiding the blind. Blindness remains no respecter of persons, and no one has been able to eradicate the fact that human beings do lose their sight. But in the brief span of my own career, the quality of blind people's existence has been greatly improved. Although much remains to be done, in the last half-century, a virtual revolution has taken place in terms of the possibilities for the visually handicapped. Many factors have influenced this revolution, including new vocational opportunities, aided by enlightened attitudes on parts of many employers and corporations. Increased chances for blind people to acquire college educations. Positive legislation assisting those with visual handicaps, especially Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, sometimes called the Civil Rights for the Handicapped Act because it prohibits discrimination against the handicapped. A public awareness of the capabilities of the blind, and radical new technologies like the Opticon and Kurzweil Reader. I believe the Arkansas Enterprises for the Blind has also played a part in improving the lives of blind people. By June of 1982, the center we opened in the Brack home in 1947 with 2 trainees has served over 5,000 individuals from 50 states and 53 other countries. Our physical plant had expanded from a single rented residence to a facility valued at over $3 million. As a result of the close cooperation between the state agencies serving the blind, the federal government, and the Lions Clubs of Arkansas, we fashioned a new approach to increase the opportunities for the adult blind to create a new life for themselves. Because a few dedicated men believed that blind people could become useful and productive citizens dependent on themselves and not on charity, we were able to create an institution that housed numerous, often unnoticed stories of courage and determination. Somewhere in the 1980s, an 8-year-old boy will suffer the loss of sight much as I did over 60 years ago, and I'm sure he will undergo the same traumatic adjustments I experienced. Hopefully, though, if we have done our work well, his opportunities of fulfilling his own potential and creating a meaningful life have increased 100-fold over those 60 years. If that is the case, then my own journey will have been a successful one.